Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital Today channel. Laura Collins had always known that power came with pressure, but nothing in her long, hard-fought political journey prepared her for the moment she would utter 4 shocking words to Nathan that would change both of their lives forever, moments before she was taken away in cuffs, framed for a crime she didn't commit but that had been carefully planted by the one man ruthless enough to move chess pieces like human sacrifices, Jens Sidwell, the quiet puppeteer lurking behind the corridors of Port Charles Power. This disaster did not begin with flashing lights and sirens, it began much earlier, with a simmering tension that had built for weeks, particularly as November sweeps approached and the pace of chaos accelerated like a broken spigot, flooding the streets of Port Charles with secrets, lies, and the dangerous arrogance of one Professor Henry Hank Dalton. Dalton, the tacky, abrasive, self-important academic who had strutted into PCU like he owned it, made enemies everywhere he went. He had no ties in town, no friends, no allies, no conscience, and no sense of consequence. And that's why Sidwell saw him as both an asset and a liability, an easy pawn to manipulate and an even easier scapegoat to sacrifice. Dalton's latest stunt, framing teen Rocco Falconeri for the destruction of his lab, was the last straw for Laura, who immediately sensed that her grandson had walked into a trap. Rocco and his friends may have been somewhere they shouldn't have been, but they didn't destroy anything. Dalton created the evidence, manufactured the details, and attempted to send a boy to jail simply because he could. Laura confronted Dalton publicly in the November 14th episode, a rare moment where her calm, controlled exterior cracked wide open. She lashed out, calling him out for targeting a child, and the tension was palpable in every word she spat. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Sidwell had already been calculating how to use this escalating feud to take care of 2 problems at once: Dalton, the rebellious minion who had stopped obeying orders, and Laura, the mayoral candidate standing in the way of his chosen puppet Ezra Boyle. Sidwell promised himself Dalton wouldn't get 3 strikes. And he meant it. Behind closed doors, Sidwell had grown increasingly irritated with Dalton's unpredictability. The scientist had once been a quiet tool, a background operative who did what he was told. But lately, Dalton had been restless, defiant, pushing back against Sidwell's agenda. The arrogance that made Dalton so insufferable was also the trait that made him dangerous. He believed he was untouchable. Sidwell, however, had the power to prove him wrong. Knowing Dalton had no roots in Port Charles made things even easier. His disappearance, injury, or death wouldn't stir any deep emotional backlash. He was the perfect target for a who cares murder mystery: no loved ones, no defenders, no witnesses. But Sidwell wanted more than a death. He wanted a narrative. A story that benefited him. A story that removed Laura from the mayoral race and taught Dalton a violent lesson simultaneously. And so he planned the hit and run. Not a messy one. Not a sloppy one. A clean, choreographed accident designed to take out Dalton and pin the blame squarely on Laura Collins. Sidwell began by tracking Laura's schedule. Her late-night meeting. Her walk to the car. Her routine of always checking her keys in dimly lit parking lots. He made sure Dalton would be there at the right time, lured by a fake emergency message instructing him to meet an unnamed informant. Dalton arrived annoyed, muttering angrily about being summoned like a dog. He didn't see Sidwell's men waiting in the shadows. He didn't see the car positioned perfectly to stage a collision. He didn't realize he was the bait in a trap meant to ensnare someone else. Meanwhile, Laura left her city meeting exhausted, frustrated with the political games, and furious about Rocco's situation. She clutched her keys tightly, the night air cold enough to sting as she walked to her car. The General Hospital preview captured her scream, echoing in darkness, because at that moment, something moved in front of her vehicle, a silhouette darting into the beam of her headlights. She swerved, slammed the brakes, but there was a thud, too quick, too real. Her heart stopped. Someone had been hit. Her hand shook violently as she opened the car door, fearful that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But Sidwell's men were already manipulating the scene, dragging Dalton into the path of impact before melting into the darkness. They recorded the moment Laura stepped out, turning her panic into evidence. Everything happened too quickly for Laura to understand. Sirens appeared faster than seemed possible, because they had been called preemptively. Officers rushed in, lights flashing, questions flying in every direction. Dalton lay motionless, alive but planted as the victim. And Laura, stumbling, heartbroken, confused, became the perfect suspect. Within hours, Ezra Boyle used the incident to call for Laura's suspension. Sidwell feigned outrage on the news, demanding justice for Dalton and for the integrity of Port Charles. Meanwhile, the police insisted protocol required Laura's arrest. Laura's world began to collapse piece by piece. The press cornered her. The city turned on her. And worst of all, she could not prove her innocence, not immediately. Nathan, loyal and heartbroken, confronted her quietly before she was escorted out in handcuffs. His voice trembled as he asked her, "Did you do this? Do I need to prepare for the worst?" Laura looked him dead in the eyes, her voice steadying even as tears streamed down her face, and she whispered the 4 shocking words that would haunt him long after the jail doors slammed shut: "Sidwell set me up." Those 4 words changed everything for Nathan. Because if Laura was right, then they weren't dealing with an accident, they were dealing with a conspiracy. A massive, calculated, deadly political move. Nathan knew Sidwell had always been slippery, but the idea that he would orchestrate a hit-and-run to eliminate 2 enemies forced Nathan to confront the biggest threat Port Charles had ever seen. As officers pulled Laura away, Nathan replayed those 4 words over and over. "Sidwell set me up. Sidwell set me up. Sidwell set me up." Nothing about Laura's behavior suggested guilt. Nothing about Dalton's presence made sense. Nothing about the timing was natural. Nathan suspected the truth but had no evidence, yet. Meanwhile, Sidwell celebrated behind the scenes, convinced his plan had killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Dalton was incapacitated, possibly dying, and Laura, his strongest political threat, was behind bars. But Sidwell underestimated one critical thing: Laura Collins doesn't go down quietly. She doesn't accept false narratives. And she doesn't stay in jail for long. Nathan began his own investigation immediately, slowly uncovering inconsistencies in the police timeline, camera footage mysteriously missing, and eyewitnesses reporting strange movements in the shadows before the collision. Rocco, distressed that his grandmother was being framed, teamed up with Dante and Sam to dig deeper. They found that Dalton had received a strange message minutes before being struck. They found tire tracks that didn't match Laura's vehicle but were wiped away before the official report. They found Sidwell had been involved in political sabotage before, but nothing as violent. And as the web of lies unraveled, Sidwell realized he may have acted too quickly, too boldly. Because Dalton's condition changed, he woke up. Groggy, confused, and unaware of the full situation, Dalton became the final unpredictable variable Sidwell failed to eliminate. His first words upon waking hinted that he saw someone else in the lot before the hit. Someone who wasn't Laura. Someone watching him. Someone moving with purpose. That information, once revealed, would blow Sidwell's plan apart. And so, as November sweeps continued, Port Charles spiraled into a full-blown whodunit, not about who hit Dalton, but who set the trap. Sidwell sent new orders: silence Dalton permanently. Remove evidence. Apply pressure to the police. But the walls were closing in, and Laura's 4 shocking words had planted a seed of truth that was already growing roots across town. In jail, Laura remained strong, even as political rivals celebrated her downfall. She trusted Nathan. She trusted truth. And she trusted that Sidwell's arrogance would eventually expose him. As Port Charles gears up for a week of explosive twists, everything hinges on what Dalton remembers, what Nathan uncovers, and how far Sidwell is willing to go to protect his power. One thing is certain: the hit and run was no accident, Laura is no criminal, and Sidwell has just ignited a war he cannot control, because the moment Laura said "Sidwell set me up," the countdown to his destruction began. As the days dragged on following Laura's arrest, the tension in Port Charles thickened like storm clouds over the harbor, a city on the edge of a political and criminal storm, and every corner seemed to whisper that something bigger, darker, and more intricate than anyone could have imagined, was underway. Nathan refused to let the situation sit idle, pacing his apartment late into the night as he replayed the footage from the parking lot over and over, rewinding the brief glimmers of movement, the way shadows shifted too deliberately, the way Dalton's stumble did not match a natural collision, and the way Laura's reaction, raw and panicked, was indistinguishable from someone witnessing a premeditated act rather than causing one herself. He scribbled notes on every possible anomaly, from tire marks to witness accounts, even considering the possibility that Dalton had been conscious long enough to see and remember something critical before Sidwell's operatives could manipulate the scene entirely. Meanwhile, inside the stark, echoing halls of the PC City Jail, Laura sat on the narrow cot, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned white, her mind racing faster than the blood pounding in her ears. She replayed every encounter she had with Dalton over the last few weeks, every confrontation, every sarcastic barb, every cruel manipulation, and every slight that now felt like it had been a prelude to this meticulously staged catastrophe. She realized how dangerous Dalton's presence truly was, not just for her political ambitions, but for the safety of her family, for the stability of the city, and for anyone who dared cross Sidwell's path. Her heart ached thinking about Rocco, knowing that the boy not only had been falsely accused once but had now been caught in a web far larger and deadlier than he could comprehend. Laura's political opponent, Ezra Boyle, had already begun to capitalize on her apparent guilt, issuing statements of moral outrage and promises of restoring order, but the savvy politician underestimated the power of truth, especially when it had been whispered clearly into Nathan's ears and shouted quietly in Laura's heart. She knew that the fight was far from over. As the city went about its daily routines, oblivious to the complex machinations unfolding behind the scenes, Sidwell maintained a calculated, cold facade, presenting himself as a concerned businessman and civic leader. Yet behind the veneer of public composure, his mind was a labyrinth of strategies, contingencies, and paranoia. Every time Dalton blinked, every time a news report hinted at inconsistencies in the case, Sidwell's control weakened, revealing cracks in the empire he believed unassailable. He underestimated one simple truth: power could be manipulated, but truth had a way of escaping even the most ironclad prisons. The next twist came when Dalton, slowly recovering from his staged injury, began to whisper to himself in the dim confines of his hospital room, eyes darting around as if expecting shadows to strike. Though he was groggy, his mind was still sharp enough to recognize the manipulation, to see the subtle signs of Sidwell's orchestration, the way medical staff seemed unusually attentive, the way security cameras were angled, the subtle absence of certain personnel during his transport. His memory of that night was fragmentary but potent. He remembered a figure moving too purposefully in the shadows, a silhouette that did not belong to Laura. That figure, he realized, was the missing puzzle piece that could unravel everything. Dalton's mind raced, connecting dots that no one else could see, linking Sidwell's past machinations, his manipulation of city politics, his ruthless handling of opponents, and his uncanny ability to predict and control human behavior. Dalton's intellect, often ignored or underestimated, now became the critical variable Sidwell had failed to account for. Back in jail, Laura was visited by a sympathetic guard who, perhaps tired of the corruption seeping through the precinct, discreetly slipped her a small notebook containing fragments of security footage, timestamps, unexplained visitor logs, and odd discrepancies in Dalton's timeline. Each note was a spark of hope, evidence that someone in Port Charles recognized the injustice and that Laura's fight was far from over. Meanwhile, Nathan took these fragments and began connecting them to his own observations, piecing together a digital map of that fateful night, overlaying timestamps, witness accounts, and vehicle trajectories, uncovering subtle inconsistencies that pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than accident. With each discovery, his determination intensified, knowing that he had to act quickly before Sidwell's influence erased the truth completely. The political landscape also began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Ezra Boyle, sensing opportunity, made bold moves that threatened to expose cracks in Sidwell's plan. The public discourse began to shift from a simple hit-and-run narrative to murmurs of conspiracy and corruption, but Boyle, too, underestimated the depth of Sidwell's reach and the complexity of the forces aligning against him. In the midst of these power plays, Rocco, desperate to protect his grandmother and clear his own name, enlisted the help of a network of friends and allies, teenagers and adults alike, who had their own grievances against Dalton and Sidwell. They began clandestine investigations, tracking Sidwell's movements, photographing shadowy meetings, intercepting messages, and compiling evidence that might, if presented at the right moment, blow open the entire scheme. Laura, though confined, became the strategic brain behind these efforts, guiding Nathan and Rocco with intuition honed over decades in politics. Every move was calculated, every action deliberate, as she leveraged the smallest details into actionable intelligence. Yet as their network grew, so did the danger. Sidwell's operatives, aware that someone was digging into the truth, began to shadow Nathan, intercept communications, and subtly intimidate witnesses. The stakes escalated from political ruin to physical danger. Laura, Nathan, and Rocco had to balance the urgency of exposing Sidwell with the careful orchestration of their own safety. Meanwhile, Dalton began to recover fully, slowly regaining consciousness and cognitive clarity. He realized that the staged accident was more than an isolated act, it was part of a larger scheme to consolidate Sidwell's power by eliminating dissenters, manipulating political outcomes, and instilling fear in anyone who dared challenge him. Dalton's intellect and knowledge of Sidwell's previous maneuvers made him a pivotal figure, potentially turning the tide if his recollections were revealed publicly. However, Dalton was cautious, aware that any premature revelation could result in his permanent silencing. He became an unexpected ally to Laura and Nathan, using coded messages, subtle gestures, and carefully timed interactions to communicate critical pieces of information. In tandem, Laura's 4 shocking words, "Sidwell set me up," echoed throughout the corridors of Port Charles, fueling a growing undercurrent of suspicion, distrust, and investigative curiosity. Citizens, political figures, journalists, and even some law enforcement officers began to question the official narrative, generating pressure on those complicit in maintaining Sidwell's illusion of control. Rumors swirled like wildfire, and Sidwell, sensing the fragile grip he had on the city slipping, intensified his machinations. He orchestrated public statements, attempted to discredit Nathan and Laura, manipulated media coverage, and sought to tighten his grip on Dalton through coercion and intimidation. Yet every action he took created ripples, unintended consequences that began to erode his carefully constructed empire. As the days stretched into nights, tension mounted to a breaking point. Laura, in the solitude of her cell, wrote letters, devised strategies, and coordinated with her allies, proving that even in confinement, she could command influence. Nathan, Rocco, and Dalton executed subtle countermeasures, intercepting communications, securing hidden evidence, and creating opportunities to expose Sidwell publicly. Sidwell, in contrast, became increasingly desperate, his arrogance blinding him to the growing threat posed by a coalition formed out of necessity, intelligence, and sheer determination. Each day became a battle of wits, each hour a test of courage and resilience. The city watched, oblivious to the chess game unfolding behind headlines, while the players maneuvered, poised for the final reveal. As November Sweeps approached its climax, the stakes could not have been higher. A single misstep could lead to destruction, incarceration, or even death, while the smallest insight could turn the tide in favor of justice. Laura's calm authority, Nathan's relentless investigation, Rocco's courage, and Dalton's intellect converged into a formidable force ready to confront Sidwell's tyranny. The intricate web of deception began to unravel as hidden truths emerged, unexpected alliances formed, and long-concealed motives were revealed. Sidwell, once untouchable, realized that the very elements he had tried to manipulate, the unpredictability of human will, the power of truth, and the courage of the innocent, were now conspiring against him. And in this maelstrom of suspense, fear, and revelation, one undeniable fact stood out: the carefully orchestrated hit and run, the framing of Laura, the targeting of Dalton, and the political machinations of Port Charles were all set on a collision course that would leave no player unchanged, and that would force every secret, lie, and betrayal into the harsh light of exposure, forever altering the landscape of power, loyalty, and justice in a city that had long thrived on shadows and whispers. As the storm of deceit and danger swirled around Port Charles, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, unaware that the fate of its most powerful and vulnerable figures hung by a thread. Laura, confined yet unbroken, continued to mastermind strategies from her cell, using her political acumen to anticipate Sidwell's moves and guide Nathan and Rocco through every nuance of the unfolding conspiracy. Dalton, now fully awake and cautiously aware of the stakes, began documenting every detail he remembered, carefully crafting a record that could not be easily suppressed, while Nathan worked tirelessly to corroborate these fragments with hard evidence. Sidwell, growing increasingly frantic, attempted to tighten his grip on the narrative, but the cracks in his plan